All right. Thanks for making the time to speak today. I'm Alex Fialho in Los Angeles, California, speaking to scholar Robb Hernández for the Miami AIDS Memorials Project and the Knowledge of AIDS Working Group on December 4th, 2024. So if you could, we'll start just personal. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself and particularly how you got started in working on AIDS and memory work.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Alex, for having me. It's an honor, and it's also rare to have these kind of opportunities to revisit a project that was very much a work of love, passion, activism that oddly enough, or ironically enough, was kind of upset, halted by yet another pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. So it came out in November of 2019, and then I had all these plans to do public speaking and events, and then lockdown happened. So it sort of found, not to get ahead, but yeah, it sort of found an audience after the fact. So it's an honor to chat with you. So, how I sort of came and got involved. In the artists that came to form archiving an epidemic really started with me in graduate school. I started in the critical studies film and television program at UCLA in fall of 2003. And part of my packaging, as many of my fellow uh, uh, grad school survivors have experienced is packaging your uh, graduate schooling comes in all shapes, sizes, usually involves TA ships and also graduate assistantships. And so I was appointed to work with my mentor, Chon Noriega, who was director of the Chicano Studies Research Center. And at that time, Chon was very much at the forefront and still is on the forefront of Chicanx arts, history, and other kinds of recovery projects. And so one of the key collections that he procured in his recovery and documentation efforts was the Robert Ciclona Ligoreta collection. And so very early on in my graduate schooling, I was kind of charged with helping to process that collection and to interview the artist Robert Ciclona Ligoreta, who I knew very little of growing up in small town Colorado, knew very little about this whole network of Chicanx avant-gardists or folks working in performance art conceptualism in East LA. These things were like not part of my regular vocabulary. After all, I was in film school. And so as I was processing the collection, I came across, um, you know, bric-a-brac, things otherwise deemed garbage or trash, food wrappers, bulk mailers, coupons. But then there were also these slides, there were these photographs in a scrapbook. And that sort of gave me the what at the time I was practicing was really a sort of visual research methodology where I was using these photographs to prompt Ligoreta into conversations about the artists, the people populating these photographs, the performance actions that were happening. And one of the major events focused in these photographs was Cockroaches Have No Friends, November 1969 in East LA, where a young Ligoreta brings his boyfriend up to stage, uh, performs fellatio on a rubber balloon phallus attached to his lap, confronting an audience of mostly friends and family, hoping to attend a Flor y Canto sort of community theater event. And it turns into um, a bit of a draggy riot. Ligoreta is in full face makeup, a lingerie slip, is performing fellatio, grabbing eggs from his crotch, throwing them at the audience. And that is really where like East LA avant-gardism, performance art in the West Coast, I would argue, sort of began. And so those seedlings led me to these larger questions about what happened to your friends, which is a natural question to have. And those friends then being people like Mundo Mesa, for example, it was his co-conspirator, his quote unquote soulmate, as he told me in interviews, who passed away from AIDS-related causes in 1985. So a question I ask in Archiving an Epidemic is, why is 1985 the last time we saw any of Mundo Mesa's artwork? Where are his paintings? I would love to analyze them. Common question a graduate student would ask. And that simple request became a much larger or helped to crystallize much larger dilemmas and issues that confront and face artists that we lost to the AIDS crisis, and in particular, artists of color as they experience AIDS crisis in very different ways.
Yeah. Thank you. It's meaningful to hear some origin story. I'll just put the picture, I'll put the book on the camera. We'll really focus on the book.
Your usual 10%.
So we'll focus on the book Archiving an Epidemic, Art AIDS in the Queer Chicanx Avant-Garde, which, as you already have started to articulate, really deeply thinks through the stakes of AIDS and archiving. I'll just say personally, it's a touchstone for my own research on AIDS-related stewardship of family and friends. I'm really grateful for the model and the methods that you bring forward in the book. And just maybe even to kind of continue this personal storytelling thread, what interested you in the stories of some of the artists like Mundo Meza, Joey Terrell, Teddy Sandoval, and which eventually became the kind of art and AIDS related histories that you bring to bear in the book?
Yeah, so what kind of brought me to those kind of artistic circles?
Yeah, what inspired it?
Yeah. No, I think it begins with helping to process the Ligoretta collection, the oral histories that I conducted with Ligoretta, all in preparation for the publication of a very short art reference book that the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center wanted to publish, highlighting different special collections that they had there. But I quickly began to recognize that unlike some of the other archives that other scholars were working on, mine was not a linear, nor was it a sort of a materially legible or recognizable body of record. And one of the methodologies I sort of work through, the sort of model I use in archiving an epidemic is archival body, archival space. And part of that was very much inspired by sorting through Legoretta's things and realizing that many of the materials there did not form an archival whole, but was really shaped by incompleteness, approximations for his body, Mesa's body, and that I already lost my train of thought. But Mesa's body. And so as I was sorting through these material, textual, sensorial disjunctions that really charged me to try to locate other people with insights into Legoretta's story, as well as some of the other artists that were a part of his orbit, like Mundo Mesa. With that in mind, I also helped process the Viva records at the Chicano Studies Research Center. Viva records were the sort of administrative remains of Viva, the first gay and lesbian Latino artist organization in LA, formed in 1987, right? So just as activists that would come to form ACT UP with the Silence Equal Death t-shirt that you happen to be wearing are fighting for their lives on the East Coast. On the West Coast, there are entire circuits and col collaborations of artists in theater and comedy and painting and photography and performance art in largely immigrant Latinx communities, also making finding new conjunctions between art and activism. And many of those artists were compatriots of Ligoretas and Mesas. And so as I was working on that project, I began to connect into some these creative circles. And so as I'm telling the Viva story, I'm realizing that there is important overlaps, many of which were germinating in Southern California and specifically East LA in the 1970s, or in other places like Long Beach. And at that time, the vocabulary of queer of color critique begins to be introduced into the field. And so that the work of Rod Ferguson really helped me figure out how to begin to talk about this kind of creative activity that was happening. And it was also a creative activity that was happening against the backdrop or in response to AIDS incursion. And it also pointed out to something else, which is that the stories of a number of these artists that I was learning about, hearing about, that really only existed in memory, in shorthand, in scant pieces of paper, or in the borders and corners of, quote unquote, bad photography. They were all either disappeared, looted, trashed, confiscated, or existed in a domestic frame. And that was something that I had never confronted before, with the assumption that archives are systematic, hermetically sealed, historically valuable records. And whether we're talking about the bric-a-brac in trash bags that I found a lot of Cyclona's performance remnants in, or the few scant traces of some of Messa's early paintings in the 1970s, they existed in other ways, and it forced a different kind of methodology, one that would take me into the borders and corners, the cracks and crevices of some of the most intimate spaces in people's homes, and not in the traditional memory palaces that I think graduate students are more traditionally trained to center in their work.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And you named archival body, archival space, the method. It's elaborate and deeply thoughtful in many directions. So this is kind of a big question, but can you just describe the method, and particularly how it supports your approach to AIDS and memory work, however helpful.
Yeah, I know, I think archival body, archival space grew very organically out of the frustrations I was having in trying to conduct this research, recognizing that the kinds of quote unquote records I needed to tell the story about AIDS aftermath in queer Chicanx artist communities looked and were and materially expressed in very different ways. And I was turning to different bodies of literature for assistance and trying to articulate what this was, these alternative archival formations, like the work of Sekovich and of course Munoz were very helpful to me, but also acknowledging that archival studies is an actual field. It doesn't begin with, Derrida or Foucault, and that there is a vocabulary there. And some of the people that excited me were the folks beginning to do work on, you know, personal archives, private archives, domestic interior spaces. And so with that as like a sort of framework, the idea of an archival space transformed for me, realizing that the object environments, the constellation of things actually looked more to me as a Latinx scholar, looked closer to the kind of material memory practices of Mexican American women's home altares, nichos, the things that I saw growing up where incandescent candles and ornate framing and the clippings of photos approximated a body, that they were divine spaces or portals or ways to kind of keep the lost your lost loved one close to you. And so one of the chief operators of a archival body archival space methodology was what I call archival elicitation, which is sort of like a oral history method that guided the entire project, and that required getting the investment, trust, and investment from queer custodians of memory of ex-lovers, best friends, co-conspirators, fellow libertines, that had bits and pieces of them that they lived with, and to invite them to take me through the way that they lived with these remnants of friends lost to AIDS, and being able to study and really observe the unique combinations, juxtapositions, constellations of literary, visual, material, affective relationships to these artists. And so archival body, archival space became something that encouraged me to create my own vocabulary for something that I just could not find in the field.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you. It's helpful. I'll say as a scholar working in related fields, frameworks like archival elicitation or containers of desire are all really helpful.
Yeah. That's something else and one of the other things I also found helpful too was, this often comes up for those of us working in, art history or museum studies. Is always this question of provenance, right? The history of ownership, and you're trying to like map out, how did this painting end up in this person's living room? Like, how did this piece of Mundo Mesa find its way, 25 years later in your front room, and how did it get there?
Yeah.
And having to deal with the occlusions and the ruptures of memory or resistance to map out a very like linear story about an object in a way that would be satisfactory, I think, to most art historians and museum studies scholars. So I sort of invite us to like read with the object tension and making that like okay.
Yes.
Because for those of us working with AIDS, we're often dealing with those kinds of complex affective conditions that also shape the whereabouts of where we find things and how they live.
Yeah, exactly. How does like the medical or cultural oblivion of AIDS impact these kind of more quote unquote traditional understandings of archiving or preservation or conservation? I mean, also your name in Queer of Color Critique, like how does Latinx histories also feel intersecting with these questions of AIDS and archives?
Like how does the Latinx thing sort of engage with that? Well,
Yes, and specifically like just the oblivion of AIDS as a like how does that impact our understanding of archives?
yeah, I mean, archive and an archival record looks very different. There's I sort of open up in the introduction of archiving an epidemic about this uh, symposium that happened about queering the archive or queering the Chicanx, queering the Chicano archive. I forget what it was called, and it was hosted by the Chicano Studies Research Center. And the image that we are looking at that is used as for promotional materials in the backdrop of all of the speakers is this snapshot that is really this sort of bizarre digital reproduction of a photo from the Cyclona scrapbook of Mundo Mesa, who is in this sort of half male, half female gaggy drag, this like import from the 19th century. And it is orated with no mention of AIDS that in 1985, all whereabouts um, of his oeuvre was destroyed. And it becomes a sort of more like a salacious kind of history hunters framework for this young man, his story, and the way that AIDS, ruin, devastation, wreckage resulted in destruction instead of as an opportunity for us to like rethink all of our presumptions about what that artist archive is or what it could be or what it could look like, and sort of trying to lean into rather than celebrate the completedness of
Yes,
his oeuvre, celebrating in the and finding opportunity to think with the incompleteness
yes,
of it. And so that was part of my thinking about how this archival formation functions and moves differently. It's also dispersed in other kinds of ways. So rather than us sort of thinking about uh, the wholeness of the container, to think about what I borrowing of the work of Ricky Pulsalanson, I think is his name, was another archive scholar about dispersion narratives and understanding that as through the trauma and the loss of AIDS, that entire collections scattered, and there's a meaning in that scattering. There are also very unique, as I find, and I mentioned this in the Teddy Sandoval chapter, these really unique exchanges that happen through artworks where through these like deeply felt queer men's relationship with their lost best friend or lost lovers, etc., that things sort of, you know, repatriate, quote unquote, in ways so that they are uniquely shared with, felt with, occupy one living room, they occupy another temporarily, and then back again. And I think that those kinds of um, effective and emotional investments with an archival body, archival space, really challenges like our terms of what an archive does domestically, personally, that sort of challenge the institutional possession and authority of, what is considered a proper, oh, hey, celebratory, a proper way um, of archive and record management. And there are other more subterranean, um, minor with the lowercase m forms of archival custody
Yeah.
that would probably abhor museum and archive and probably history professionals, but are nonetheless important for us to document and think with and acknowledge as another kind of preservation um, that sort of refuse the authority of mainstream institutions.
Yeah. Thank you. And
I don't know if I answered your question.
no,
Sorry.
definitely. No, you definitely did. And I'm also still thinking about your kind of reference to the home altars
Mm,
and this kind of domestic space um, in Mexican American contexts. And I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about how something like a home altar or these other sites in domestic spaces might relate to and also depart from understandings of memorials or monuments. Um,
yeah. Yeah. No, I think about and this is where the, sort of archival elicitation activities I did with a number of the participants in the book help challenge my ideas about monuments and memorials, sort of thinking about um, monuments from a capital M to a lowercase m, sort of thinking through I think I use the term like micro memorials
mm,
or these crevices or corners of home specific cabinetry or these enclosed spaces that sort of become monumental, but are in uh, small scale form, sort of challenging how we think about, memorials as these large scale granite or concrete public acts. But like, what does that look like for a virus? One of the questions I sort of ask my students, like, how do you create a monument, a memorial to a virus that has not ended, which is often how monuments work to like punctuate the end, or things that maybe don't work well for as a, felt or fiber expression through a quilt. What are other kinds of material cultural expressions to expand the terms of what monument and memorial is? And so, it ranges everything from like the ceramic graveyard that I talk about in the backyard of the Silver Lake home of Paul Polabinskas and Teddy Sandoval, where all of the failed ceramic projects that shattered, pulverized, and linger as um, uh, shards of things find new life in a different kind of ecology of failure in the backyard, and how some of those pieces end up looking and mirroring like the same large scale ceramic pieces are used in this public art piece for a metro rail station. So that kind of language that is happening between these disparate spaces, I think really um press us to think about what is, how do you create a monument or a memorial to, a ceramicist that doesn't speak in a language of fabric, that doesn't speak in a language of like traditional monument, that speaks in a language of earth, of earthware, of clay, of ash. And I think that what Paul ends up doing in the backyard um, in that ceramic graveyard, in that uh, championing of kiln failure, it also becomes an appropriate place to spread his ashes. And his ashes are spread in other kinds of places, including a tree that was in the backyard of one of their best friends in San Francisco, when that paver I find in the corner of his Palm Springs home. That's just another form of connectivity that sort of extends the self, extends the memory in ways that I think really challenge a like monument and memorial record that can become static, um, implanted, and sort of unmovable, or sort of, you know, concretized and fossilized in one kind of way. There's lots of micro monuments, memorials that uh, kind of connect to that body, that look and function differently. So I think that, and some of those ideas I think are very much rooted in what Mexican American home altares do, which is a sort of making do expression of improvisation and working with, what is at hand.
Yeah, and that's, I'm also even thinking about like something like a coffee mug that I think you bring in um, as by Sandoval, which feels, you know, visceral and bodily and connected. And I mean, that's why I really appreciate that chapter in this conversation, in the sense that you also go on to describe the public cited large scale artwork, Gateway to Highland Park,
Yeah.
and think through the kind of like the politics and the processes of that artwork coming to be, particularly after Sandoval's passing, through the stewardship of his partner. So yeah, I wonder if you can rehearse some of those details of kind of like the politics and the processes, and why those sites matter to your research, but like more broadly to memorials and memorialization.
Yeah, I mean, that project's real interesting because, you know, a part of the conflict, um, it, part of the conflict focuses on the incorporation of dice chairs. And for Sandoval, and this is something that Paula Binskas, his partner, his late partner, recently just passed away, um, intuitively understood, was in the late 1980s, early 90s, when he gets this commission. Sandoval is trying to develop a language and a vocabulary for what is happening to him and his friends. And so HIV infection for him was about dice, that the that finding out about your HIV positive status was really a sort of game of chance, a game of luck. It would just so happen to be a turn of the dice. And while that created a lot of conflict for the governmental powers, that were, I think, fearful or anxious over the reaction from the Native American community, given that the installation of the public art piece was so close to the Southwest Museum, it was something that Paul fought for because of what it meant to Teddy. And he went so far as to document the many ways in which Teddy incorporated dice, um, this sort of dice visual vocabulary in everything from prints, watercolors, drawings to also ceramic pieces to demonstrate that these dice were no commentary about Native American gambling. It had everything to do with it, with Sandoval's way of working through his own HIV diagnosis, which made it really unique again in how do we concretize and represent not just AIDS loss, but your seropositive status, which is also, I think, what made the dice of, sort of different in terms of how we've tend to historicize or think about the AIDS Monument Memorial Record. And so it's coded very differently there. And just for funsies, that's a word, Paula Binscott shows up at the opening of the MTA station after the numerous back and forth with the different agencies and the museum and the boards, wearing a shirt made out of a textile that was selected by their close friend, Jeff Horique, who was also Mundo Mesa's ex-lover, who was also positive at that time. Fashion designer wearing a shirt fabricated from a textile of, twirling dice, sort of wink and nod that this is about AIDS. This is about HIV, and it was about, preserving Teddy's memory. It's no surprise that after Sandoval's really only retrospective show opened up at the Vincent Price Art Museum just last year, that Paul passed away like weeks later. I think, it was very poetic, and he did what he did with the gateway to Highland Park, just to finally see the full realization of Teddy's memory and in a way that gave people access to celebrate and remember him. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't think I answered your question.
No, you definitely did. And I might riff a little bit on some of the themes that are coming forward, which is, I'll just say I went and visited the Gateway to Highland Park this weekend on World AIDS Day, to experience it firsthand, to see those guardian winged figures, ceramic and tile. It's just very meaningful and powerful in that context. And it also makes me think of archiving an epidemic. I coordinated and created a project, the Last Address Tribute Walk, while working at Visual Aids, and you write about it. It's incredibly meaningful to have your thinking about the project. But there's something about your emphasis on the domestic and thinking about these questions that makes me think of the Last Address Tribute Walk. I think also because you've written about it, but to say like these sites of home, whether it's Keith Haring's address, 562 LaGuardia Place, or these 28 addresses in Ira Sachs's film, which he shows from the exterior, which then, in relationship to these visual aids events, Last Address Tribute Walks, we would go to the sites and have people who knew these people or were intergenerationally inspired by these artists who had passed from AIDS do readings and performances on these doorsteps in Harlem, Times Square. All it is to say that these kind of like questions of return, or these like rituals of return to these spaces where people called home, and your investment and engagement with these sites of home and family and friends, feels very meaningful, and also like like a micro monument, or just like a lowercase monument or a lowercase memory that may not be what we're talking about with like a plaque or a punctuated memorial, but instead is kind of a more ongoing and activation of these memories. So that's all kind of coming to mind for me. And I think as we kind of wind down, just interested to hear from you. Are there some of the kind of creative examples of AIDS memory work, maybe beyond the book or elsewhere that inspire you or that you think of as creative and exciting contexts for thinking about AIDS memory, as you note, and for an ongoing virus that is has not ended.
Right. Yeah, I think in that section of the book, I sort of asked that question about, yeah, would like Claus Nomi recognize the East Village, but like really trying to empower the yeah, walking in Ghost Step
Yes.
and to do something that I think a lot of more traditionally trained or more systemically committed archivists and curators tend not to do, which is to like work and speak on behalf of the ghosts and be in defense of the ghosts, which I think can create different kinds of dilemmas, but those are the kinds of projects that I still remain very like passionate about and committed to because for there's like what th essentially three main artists case studies in archiving an epidemic, but the totality of like what I've produced so far as a professor in an English department, no doubt, is still a process of recovery and documentation and working with really working with or trying to magnify moments where Latinx AIDS memorial and meaning contribution to the arts is confronted, but like rarely considered in that way. So I recently published a piece on the artist Humberto Dionisio, who was from Cuba. He's a Marielito. He comes over in 1980. He is detained in a tent city in Miami, where his cousin is able to bring him home. And he is only in Miami working for 7 years before his AIDS-related death, 1987. The more fascinating part about that story is that for an artist not well known and outside of a certain South Florida art circuits, his work finds its way into the Smithsonian and becomes like a centerpiece for Day Without AIDS in 1994 and is a major Latinx art commission to the permanent collection of what at the time was the National Museum of American Art, the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And so how like Humberto Dionisio does that, another artist like Carlos Alfonso, another artist like creative persona, activist persona like Pedro Zamora, all become these figures in the early 1990s that help this nation confront kind of vocabulary around HIV AIDS, all of which happen to be Marielitos um, living in Florida or had lived in Florida, and then come to like focus AIDS memory, not just as like, refugees or asylees, but to help a nation confront this virus is such a fascinating chapter of AIDS history, and I want to know more about that and how Cubans become so instrumental in that narrative and in that history. And so my hope is that we can continue to kind of return to these very complicated and maybe unexpected ways that queer Latinidades has really helped the US confront its AIDS national memory.
Amazing. I was going to ask, maybe as a final note, these kind of through lines or conversations between Southern California, East LA to Miami with this Miami AIDS Memorials Project, but I think you just took us there. So,
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
exciting.
yeah, and even in the article, I mean, the one thing in the article that did kind of drop out of it is and it kind of is a lesson I learned from archival body, archival space about like object tension, which is the label that they used, and it is the gift of that art piece, that assemblage is you know, in memory of Umberto Dionisio, on behalf of like Jim Kitchens, who ends up sort of becoming a third party, who ends up becoming the like estate executor of the Dionisio collection. So there are also these like very interesting ways in which queer custodianship, because of the devastation of HIV/AIDS, didn't necessarily become adopted by one executor, but sometimes move second, third, fourth hands as well. And so I think that those kinds of stories, when we talk about AIDS memory and memorialization and historicization, I think need to come out more fully, especially as institutions like the Smithsonian struggle to find a vocabulary to talk about heritage preservation, in terms that where queerness and AIDS and the refugee status of an artist can really be disruptive but completely productive um to the to a window onto AIDS art and activism.
Amazing. Where was it published?
American Art,
American Art. Great.
couple years ago. Yeah.
Well, I think that's all I have. If there's anything else you want to add into the mix, happy to hear it, or we can call it a conversation.
So thank you so much for like giving me an opportunity to talk more about this project and this work. I'm glad it's finding an audience, and I'm glad it's like in some way assisting you in producing a very important dissertation, which I'm sure would be an amazing book that I look forward to reading.
Awesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're
I'm going to
welcome.
stop the recording and we'll stay on.